Okay, our authentication is working, but again, there is a problem with this implementation. Here in the logout method, we're tightly coupled to Firebase. And similarly, in our login component, in the login method, we have this tight coupling. You might ask, what are the problems with this tight coupling? There are two problems. The first problem is testability. So when you want to unit test this component, we don't want to go to Firebase. We don't want to redirect the user to the Google login page. We want to mock this. We want to pass a fake authentication service. So this is one problem. The other problem is the lack of separation of concerns. So our component is tightly coupled to Firebase authentication. This is not the responsibility of a component. The component should tell another class, like an authentication service, hey, log in this user or log them out. The component shouldn't care how the actual authentication is performed. Today we're using Firebase. Maybe tomorrow we use auth0 for our authentication. Now, if we have multiple places in our application where we give our users the ability to log in, with this implementation, then we have to go to all these different places and modify our code. So we want to encapsulate how authentication is performed inside a separate service. And then we're going to reuse that service potentially in multiple places. And when we're going to unit test our application, we can pass a fake service. So let me show you how to refactor this code and extract a service. Let's open up the terminal and generate a new service. So nggs, we're going to call this auth. Okay, now let's go to app module and register this service as a provider. So auth service. Okay, now let's go to this service, auth service. Here in the constructor, we're going to inject AngularFire auth object. So AngularFire auth, exactly like how we injected the service inside our components. Now we should add two methods, login and logout. Next, we need to move the code for login and logout that we implemented in our components inside the service. So I'm going to go to login.component.ts. Here's our login method. I'm going to cut this and move it right here in our service. So note that here we are newing up this Firebase Google Auth Provider object. This is about the implementation detail. So it's okay to new up this object here because during unit testing, we're not going to unit test this class. We're not going to unit test this service. We're going to unit test our component. In fact, we cannot unit test the service because this service is all about integration. It's going to talk to Firebase. It's going to redirect the user to Google login page. We cannot unit test this. So back in our login component, now we no longer need to inject this AngularFire auth object here. Instead, we need to inject our auth service. And then let's rename this parameter to auth. And here in our login method, we simply call this.auth.login. And in the future, when we want to write a unit test for this component, we call this login method and assert that is calling the login method of our authentication service. So we are testing the interaction of this component with our auth service. Also, with this, we no longer need to import Firebase on the top. Let's delete this. And in fact, we need to add this to our auth service. So you can see this class is all about implementation detail. It's about how login and logout are implemented. That's why we have dependencies to Firebase. In contrast, in our login component, we don't care how authentication is done. We're simply delegating to this auth service. And this also means we no longer need this import statement. Now we have a cleaner implementation with better separation of concerns. Now similarly, I'm going to go in our navbar component and move the code in the logout method into our new service. So let's add that here. Beautiful. Then back in our navbar component, Similarly, instead of injecting an AngularFire object, we need to inject our auth service. Let's rename this to auth. And here in the logout method, we simply call this .auth.logout. Now finally, we need to define this user observable in our service so we can subscribe to it from the outside. So I'm going to cut this here, back to our auth service. In the constructor, we initialize this user observable. And this also means we should define user observable as an observable of Firebase.user. And finally, we should also rename this to AF auth. Now, if you're even a more experienced developer, you may argue that here we are leaking our implementation detail to the outside, because the type of this user field is observable of Firebase.user. So this is not a proper abstraction. And this is actually a valid argument. So if you want to be a purist, then you need to define your own user class and write some extra code to map Firebase user objects to your user objects. But for the purpose of this project, I find this an unnecessary complexity, because here we're actually using Firebase. We're building this application for Firebase. So this is the scope of our application. What you need to take away here is that adding all these extra abstractions is going to increase the complexity of your application. In this case, we added this abstraction auth service simply to enable testability of our components and also have better separation of concern in our code. So let's finish this up. Back to our navbar component. Now we no longer need to define this user field here because we can access it from our auth service. So let's delete this. Now back in our navbar template. So this is where we have referenced that field. I'm going to change this to auth.user. Okay. Now finally, we need to change the access modifier for this field from private to public, because when we build our application for production, ahead of time compiler expects these fields that we use in our template to be public. So back in our component, I'm going to change this access modifier to public. And finally, we no longer need to import Firebase here, and same for AngularFire, as well as the observable. Our component code is cleaner, and we have properly distributed responsibility in our application.